From Hollywood to Rochdale, actor Hopwood DePree's restoration challenge. With his Colgate smile and unseasonal tan, Hopwood DePree looks every inch the Tinseltown filmmaker he once was, but now he's crossed the pond to save a stately home. When Hollywood actor-director Hopwood DePree was growing up in the U.S. state of Michigan, his exotic name was the source of a good deal of grief. "Kids would beat me up when they found out my real name," he says. "They said I should have been named Bob. Or Steve." Things got so bad that he decided to call himself Todd instead. But in later life he learned to embrace his weird name after discovering that he had been given it as part of a family tradition aimed at keeping alive their links to a distinguished line of English gentry that had lived in a 60-room stately home near Manchester for centuries. "My grandfather used to talk about Hopwood Hall when I was a boy, but I always thought he was telling a fairy tale." Hopwood DePree. Last September he took the extraordinary decision to sell his home in Los Angeles, which enjoys 12 hours of sun a day in April, and moved to Lancashire, 21 days of rain, spurred on by a dream of restoring the crumbling ruin to its former glory. "My grandfather used to talk about Hopwood Hall when I was a boy, but I always thought he was telling a fairy tale," he says. "Years later I was living in LA, and one night while looking online at an ancestry website I was amazed to realize Hopwood Hall was real and still standing. I sent an email, and the next day I had responses saying the hall was in need of help and wondering if I would be coming to England anytime soon." The director of TV film Gordo's Road Show, and once named among 20 people to know by The Hollywood Reporter, duly booked a flight to Manchester to scope out the house for himself. It must have made for a depressing sight. Burglars had stolen the lead from the roof, with the result that rainwater had been leaking in for years. Thieves had also made off with parquet flooring and York stone paving. Walls were covered in graffiti and much of the woodwork had dry rot. DePree was not discouraged, however. "The first time I walked into Hopwood Hall I was blown away by how old it was, dating to at least 1426 and perhaps earlier. I was taken into a room with intricate wood carvings in the oldest part of the hall and learnt that this is where my 14th great-grandfather was born. I was completely moved." In its heyday the Grade II listed manor house employed 28 gardeners to maintain its parkland, gardens, ice house, and grotto, and hosted guests of the stature of Lord Byron. When the invitations went out for George V's coronation in 1911, Colonel Erg Hopwood of the Lancashire Hussars was on the list. But after the two last remaining heirs to Hopwood Hall were killed in the First World War, it gradually fell into disrepair. "My grandfather used to talk about Hopwood Hall when I was a boy, but I always thought he was telling a fairy tale." Hopwood DePree. Meanwhile, DePree's branch of the family had settled in the U.S. in the 1700s and, at the time the American War of Independence broke out in 1775, Moses Hopwood was running a plantation 20 miles from one owned by George Washington. When the first U.S. president needed an aide-de-camp, he settled on Moses' son John, who went on to serve Washington throughout the 8-year conflict. The Hopwood surname was lost in the late 19th century when Alcindor Hopwood married one Newton Black, but, as we have seen, male heirs were christened Hopwood to remind them of their roots. Fast forward a century or so and our hero is determined to revive the ancient family seat. "I was told that experts estimated the hall would be lost within 5 to 10 years unless something was done to save it," says DePree, 47. "I immediately felt a strong obligation, thinking if I am the only Hopwood currently on Earth in a position to save it, then I must." After signing a deal with the current owner, Rochdale Council, that gives him 3 years to put in place a financial plan for its renovation and transformation into a centre for the arts, he moved to the UK on a 3-year visa. There were some teething problems, notably when he was laughed out of a local chippy for trying to pay for a pie with his American Express card, but he insists the area is one of those places where I instantly feel at home. He moved into a rented house near the home and hopes to be living there soon. I am refurbishing a small flat in the hall that will be a temporary living accommodation. Living there will provide an extra layer of security as well as create new life and energy at the hall. His priorities are to stabilize the building and make it weatherproof. He has roped in various local colleges to help. Students at Manchester School of Architecture are working on renovation proposals. Horticulturalists at Hopwood College are helping with the garden, and he is in talks with the college's bricklaying course to use its apprentices to help rebuild the boundary walls. He has received £276,000 from Historic England and Rochdale Borough Council for emergency works, and he plans to raise the £10 million he will need to complete the project through a combination of grants, donations, and private equity funding. Moving to England has been a huge life change, but I love it, he says. I'm open to experiencing British life. I'm now a tea drinker. I like fish and chips, and I bought a waxed coat, wellies, and a cap. And of course an umbrella.